It turns out the British Columbia NDP is a huge budget surplus. It really throws a wrench into the idea that the NDP can't manage the economy. Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for stopping by. You know, there's this ubiquitous myth in liberal and conservative circles that the NDP doesn't know how to balance a budget, that they can't be fiscally prudent, that they'll recklessly spend and they'll throw provinces into debt, and in so doing they'll hurt the people that they like the most, poor and marginalized and working class people. They'll suffer due to NDP incompetence. That's a myth that pervades Canadian politics. And so for most people that myth does hold true because in federal politics, the NDP has never governed. It's always been liberal and conservative governments. And in many provinces, they're usually dominated by either liberal or conservative parties. But in British Columbia, the NDP is currently in power, and they have a budget surplus. Now, a lot of people feel like these things don't match, the NDP and budget surpluses, but the reality is that NDP governments at the provincial level, over broad history, are good fiscal managers. So with this video, I want to talk a bit about 3 myths that are being busted right now by the British Columbia NDP, and then what they should do going forward out of this. So that first myth is that the NDP are poor fiscal managers. And it's proven false because of this broad history. NDP governments tend to run fewer deficits and are generally good at balancing the budget because they operate differently than liberal and conservative governments. And the reason is that the NDP will, rather than offer tax cuts, will raise taxes to provide the services people need. So when you see Doug Ford has made so much political hay about Ontario's debt. And yet it's expanding under him because while he is making cuts, he's also lowering provincial revenues by giving away tax cuts to the rich. And by doing that, he's not actually solving the fiscal issues. And sometimes liberal governments, they'll be austerity minded, but they won't raise taxes. Or left-leaning liberal governments will not cut programs as much, but will not raise taxes on the wealthy sufficiently to such a degree that the budget situation remains poor regardless. So, with NDP governments like those in British Columbia, you don't see cuts, but you do see taxes raised predominantly on the wealthy. And in so doing, you create a situation where you can have good fiscal policy and the services people need. The rich just have to pay a little bit more. It's as simple as that. People will tell you politics is more complicated than that, but at its core, it's really not. You can kind of have it all if the rich people pay their fair share. And they don't currently in most parts of the country, and that's why we don't have both good programs and relatively low levels of debt. BC shows the way forward, and it's good to see. Another factor that BC is myth-busting about is that governments can't keep their promises. Justin Trudeau and Doug Ford both broke major promises to people. Justin Trudeau broke numerous promises to Indigenous people and to every Canadian about electoral reform, and Doug Ford promised not to lay people off. He promised to fix the budgetary issues, and of course, the debt continues to expand, and teachers and other frontline workers are getting laid off, sometimes in the hundreds. Both of those parties have broken key promises. And they both have majorities, so they have absolute power to implement their visions. They have, all the votes they need in the House of Commons or in the Ontario legislature. John Horgan, on the other hand, only has a minority government, meaning that in a lot of ways he has to compromise. And yet, he's kept over 75% of his promises, and they're only a couple years into government. The major promises of this BC government has been kept, and that's a good thing to see, because when you vote for the NDP, or when you get an NDP government, you might not always get what you want, especially if you're a liberal or a conservative, but you'll get what people voted for, at least for the most part. John Horgan, for instance, promised an electoral reform referendum. He didn't promise a result. He didn't promise, if we win, we will implement electoral reform. He promised a referendum within 18 months, and he 100% delivered on his promise. Justin Trudeau, of course, he lied about electoral reform. He promised the end of first past the post, unequivocally, and it didn't happen because he lied to Canadians. That's an example of a difference. And again, John Horgan has a minority government and kept a promise where Trudeau made a similar promise and couldn't keep it despite full control over the House of Commons. So in a sense, this is a great opportunity here for people to understand that NDP governments are pretty trustworthy. And I think that's important to know. Because again, you might not like everything they'll do, but you'll have a general sense for what they'll do. The third factor here is this really vindicates the NDP Green cooperation. A lot of people think minority governments are inefficient and unstable, but the BC Green, BC NDP coalition, the soft coalition, has been a success, in broad terms. As an NDPer, there are a lot of times where I'm like, I wish the Greens wouldn't slow down our path towards improving labor standards on the minimum wage and on card check certification, and I'm sure the Greens would like the BC NDP to be a little bit more strident on the environment, but the reality is that on broad terms, both parties are doing pretty well. And I think both parties are happy with the cooperation thus far. In that way, I think this is a great example to Canadians that minority governments can work quite well and can be quite stable. There's no sign that this minority government is teetering. There's no sign that the Greens are itching for an election or the NDP is itching for an election and are going to, cancel the coalition. This government could last the full 4 or 5 years as a minority, and that's relatively rare in Canadian politics. And this minority government is special for another reason. It's special because it combines for the first time ever in modern Canadian politics a coalition not including either the Liberal or Conservative parties, but instead the Greens and the NDP. But it also combines two parties, neither of which are the biggest in the legislature. It's very rare in Canada that the party with the most seats isn't the party governing. It's very rare. Most of the time in minority governments, it's usually the biggest party governing, often with support of a smaller party. For example, in the 60s and 70s, there were some Liberal minority governments at the federal level that required NDP support to function, to survive, and there were some good things that came out of those cooperations, and that was an example. But it's rare to see the second place party take government from the support of smaller parties, which is what we saw in BC. And this soft coalition of the Greens and the NDP represents a far greater chunk of voters than most majority governments do, because if you add up the Green vote and the NDP vote in BC, you get over 55% of the vote. It's an incredibly high level of support for a minority government based on the percentage of people who voted for a party in support of that government. This is a great opportunity, not just for the BC Greens and the BC NDP, but for Canadian politics to have a new paradigm, to really give credence to the idea that parties working together create great results. And that not only does that have to include the biggest parties, but that sometimes smaller parties can work together to form a government and do a good job of it, and that doesn't even have to include the major party in the legislature. There's nothing that gives them the ordained right to govern just because they won the most seats if they can't command the confidence of the House. This should, in my view, also encourage people towards electoral reform, because although this result was reached via first past the post, it demonstrates what could happen under a proportional system, but where the Greens and the NDP together would equal over 50% and could form a stable government representing the will of the population better than the Liberals on their own. That's a great result, and I hope we see that coast to coast to coast. I hope we see, both within first past the post, greater minority governments that bring together progressives, even if they're not the biggest parties, and I want this to be an example of what's possible under a proportional system. Because under proportional systems, the vast majority of governments will be minority governments, because it's relatively rare that a party in a 3-party or 4-party system gets anywhere near 50% of the vote. So on any of these fronts, on the idea that the NDP can't govern, or on the idea that coalitions between minority parties are wrong, or the idea that promises can't be credibly kept by governments once they win, I think the BC NDP is proving all of those concepts erroneous. But there's a big step that needs to come from the NDP here. I think that this just has to be the start. The $1.5 billion surplus is great, unequivocally. Great news for the BC NDP and for progressive politics across the country. But it shouldn't stop there. An NDP government shouldn't be content with just having an operating surplus. Rather, it should take some of that money and put it to the progressive vision that the NDP supports. And I have to feel that where that money should go first and foremost is universal dental care for all British Columbians. John Horgan has talked about the need for dental care. Last year, at the end of 2018, he noted that one of the things he wants to do is implement a universal dental care program because he knows the social and health costs that come when people are missing teeth or have poor quality teeth. And we all know that good preventative dental care that, stops cavities from happening or stops small cavities from turning into major infections that land people in the hospital will have cost savings over the medium and long term. If Canadians and British Columbians have good dental health, the rest of the health will be better overall. And it makes no sense from my view that dental care isn't part of our traditional healthcare system. Why is almost every other body part covered, but your teeth aren't? Makes no sense in my perspective. And so the BC NDP now has a $1.5 billion surplus, and they could take that money and build a provincial dental care program. The Ontario NDP suggested that the plan would cost about $1.2 billion here in Ontario. That's what they suggested back in 2018. So if you take into account that British Columbia has fewer people and is a smaller province, that their costs could actually be lower. So you wouldn't even have to necessarily use the full surplus on a national dental care program. But by using some of it on that program, you not only demonstrate that the NDP is fighting for regular people, but they can do so while keeping the public purse relatively in good health. And I think that's incredibly important. So guys, this is a great opportunity for progressives in Canada. What the BC NDP has done so far challenges and tears down so many mythologies about the NDP and what the NDP can't do. But it also offers an opportunity if John Horgan and the BC NDP are willing to take the football and run with it. They still have time to govern. And while there's no guarantee that the British Columbia Greens will actually support John Horgan's dental plan, I have a feeling they probably will because it's something that a lot of progressives support. So that's the way forward. Keep doing what you're doing and implement a new bold program. Because here's the thing. Provincial programs are often incubators for things that have federal weight, that transform the country. Medicare didn't start as a federal program in Canada. It started as a dream in Tommy Douglas's Saskatchewan before it went coast to coast to coast. And John Horgan, if he wants to build that legacy, he could be the father of dental care. And 50 years from now, we could be talking about British Columbia and how they started something great when no one else would. And once again, it would be an NDP government doing what Liberals and Conservatives either couldn't or wouldn't do. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks again for stopping by. If you can, I would appreciate if you like, comment, and subscribe. Doing so helps to spread the message, to let people know about the misinformation around the NDP, the contemporary and historic misinformation, and let people know that the NDP actually does have the ability to be both progressive and pragmatic. Also, for the same reason, I would appreciate your support on Patreon. Supporting me there brings more quality and quantity of content to this channel, but it also helps to promote coverage of Canadian politics from a left-wing perspective here on YouTube, which is sorely, sorely needed. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.